Hello, welcome to Module 2, Section 1, Lesson 2, the Neuroscience Systems, and this lesson is on the brain. Personally, my favorite lesson. So the cool thing about the brain, well, there's so many cool things about the brain, but we're actually going to get into that in this lesson. Before we do that, let's take a look at what we know from the previous lessons and how they all play into each other. So we just reviewed the nervous system. Now we're taking a look at the brain, and then the next two lessons will be biological neural networks and microstructures of the brain. So again, from last lesson, we learned that the nervous system is made up of the central and peripheral nervous system, which breaks down into subsequent parts. And we learned that the brain is this headquarter, main central processing unit for all of this function. We also know that the brain can be viewed as an entire unit, and we can look at the properties of the entire unit, and then we can also break it down into smaller pieces and look at those functions in isolation. So the main questions for the lesson today are, what are the different regions of the brain? How can we split it into different parts, and how do we categorize these regions? How does the brain behave as an entire unit? So again, what are the functions of the brain when we're looking at the brain as a whole? And how do the hemispheres of the brain contribute to overall function? So we have a right hemisphere, left hemisphere. How do they work together, work independently, and how do they contribute to this entire function of the brain? The human brain, what a beautiful organ. All right, so I'm sure all of you have some fascination with the brain, whether that be that we literally don't know much about it, or whether that be it has electrical signaling within our bodies, or it is our process for decision making, or it goes to sleep when we go to sleep. You know, there's so much about the brain to learn, to discover, to research, and there's clearly a fascination about it that is multifaceted. So let's break it down into what we do know. We know that the brain weighs about 3 pounds. That's awesome. It consumes about 20% of the human body energy, which is about 100 watts for the human body. So itself consumes about 20 watts. It has 100 billion neurons. Can't even wrap my head around that number. 100 billion neurons and 100,000 miles of blood vessels. We know this is a very intricate structure just by looking at the anatomy and looking at the physiology of what we know about the brain. An analogy I like to use to explain the significance of the brain and neurotechnology is if we're thinking about a city and we want to manipulate the function for the city. Let's say we want the city to attract consumers specifically. How are we going to do that? What steps do we need to take to understand how to manipulate the function of the city? So if you think about that, in my head, I'm visualizing blueprints, right? I want to know what the layout of the city is, what the structures look like, how many people live in these residential areas, and what type of shopping centers we have nearby. A lot of data needs to be mapped out so we can start to manipulate the function of the city. So we do need to create this map of all of the areas, the location, and then we can start to look at, all right, this location serves to perform this function. So the brain allows us to study the mapping of neural activity. And the neurotechnology is where we come in and we want to change the function. We want to manipulate how things are done, why things are done certain ways. So that's the significance of studying the brain. It's really our roadmap for all of neurotechnology. So here's a slide that contains a cross section of the brain. So this is taking our brain, splitting it right down the middle. So you can start to match things up from the two pictures. You can see that the neomammalian is the larger, most outward part of the brain, and then we have the paleomammalian, which we call the limbic system, which will come up later, and then the reptilian, which is the oldest part of the brain. And we call it reptilian brain because if you're to look at really old fossils and images of reptiles, you can see that their brains are shaped like that and contain those components. So here we will talk about the brainstem and the cerebellum. So if we were to go back here, that is composed within the reptilian brain. So it is made up of these four parts: the medulla oblongata, pons, midbrain, and also cerebellum. So medulla oblongata, highlighted in red on the left here, controls involuntary processes such as respiration and circulation, really important things for our survival. The pons communicates between the forebrain and the cerebellum, and it is responsible for some sensation information. The midbrain controls motor movement and sensory processing, and the cerebellum, big in coordination, speech, and balance. It is also a relay center. So something I want to point out is none of these components within the brain, these categories and whatnot, function in isolation. They all work together to provide overall functions. So though we may be telling you, all right, the pons is responsible for communication, number one, that doesn't mean that the pons is the only brain region that communicates. And number two, that also doesn't mean that the pons only is responsible for communication. So in both senses, they don't work in isolation, they work together, and they have multiple functions that are distributed among the brain. All right, so here's a slide where we're breaking down the components of the limbic system. So this is the next level of the brain. We were at reptilian, now we're looking at neomammalian, which is also called the limbic system. So limbic, I always think about feelings, emotions. So we have the amygdala, which is the emotion processing center. Some of you may be familiar with the amygdala. I learned it as Amy G. Dalla, and Amy G. Dalla is a bitch, excuse my language, because she really holds on to things, won't forget about it. And the reason is because when we have like really traumatic events, very strong emotion associated with an event, that is processed in your amygdala, and that's like scarred into your brain. Like you will not forget this event. And most of you can probably think of like some childhood incident with very, very strong emotion. And the reason that you remember it so vividly is because of Amy G. Dalla. So that's the amygdala. We have the thalamus, which is a relay center, which if you notice from the other side, we did have another brain region, cerebellum, which is also a relay center. So like I was saying, none of these really work in isolation. A lot of functions are distributed among a lot of different parts. Hippocampus is responsible for memory formation. The hippocampus does a lot, but we do associate it mostly with memory formation, and this comes up a lot when we're taking a look at memory, especially when we're looking at neurotechnologies that target memory. Okay, now let's look at the cortex. So we have four lobes within the brain. We've got occipital, frontal, parietal, and temporal. So occipital, back here, responsible for visual processing. So when you're looking at this slide, all this information's coming in, all being processed through your occipital lobe. We've got parietal, is right here, integrating sensory information. So a lot of these brain regions deal with sensory information. We can see that that's clearly a very important part of nervous system function. Frontal lobe, higher executive function, and that also is composed of the prefrontal cortex, which we assign a lot of complex cognitive processes to that. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is responsible for sensory processing. So right about here. And notice that parietal and temporal have similar functions. So again, these functions are distributed among various regions of the brain. Brain plasticity, probably one of the coolest concepts of the brain. So this idea that our brain is plastic, it can change and distribute different information and connections over time is very, very intriguing. And the reason is because we used to have this understanding that the brain would form by the time you're in your like 20s, and then that's it. Can't change your brain, that's all you got, and that's what you're gonna get. But the more research has been done, we've seen that the brain actually does change over time. And a good way to think of this is use it or lose it. Some of you may have taken a language in high school and you would have thought, okay, once I learned Spanish for 3 years, I'll know Spanish for my lifetime. And then you're in Spain or you're talking to someone and you think you can carry a conversation in Spanish or French, and you can't. And that's because you haven't been practicing, and your brain will get rid of something it thinks you don't need. So because you didn't tell your brain repetition and constant speaking in that language, your brain's like, oh, I don't need this. I need to let it go and make room for the stuff I do need. So, yes, you might have lost a little bit of the skills, but don't worry, because your brain is plastic, you can gain that back. So, there are advantages and disadvantages, right? So, the advantages to brain plasticity is that we can actually change the composition of our brain. And this can be good if there's something we don't want or if there's something we want that we don't have. So, we can take scans periodically and then diagnose based off of those scans and see how does the brain change from time A to time B, and how can we correlate that to other changes happening in the body or in cognitive function. We can repair damage that's been done in the brain. There's been some studies with PTSD and brain plasticity. I encourage you to look into that if you're interested. And then disadvantages include brain changes can lead to mental illness. There is research being done with Alzheimer's in which they are trying to map the physical brain change that causes this disease. And again, I encourage you to research that if you're interested in that. And excess connections in the brain can cause noise when we're recording electrical activity. Okay, now let's break the brain into our right and left. And it's actually like flipped. So right and left are on other sides. All right. When we're looking at it, we see right and left. So the right is responsible for emotion processing and recognizing emotions, visual spatial abilities, interpreting algebraic equations, attention on the external environment, and it controls the left side of your body. So all of this, my left arm, my left leg, is all being controlled by my right brain. The left brain, it has language centers, which are Broca's and Wernicke's, which we will get into later. But essentially, one is responsible for the comprehension of speech, and one is responsible for the actual movements I do with my mouth when I speak. So that's Broca's, Wernicke's understanding. And then attention on internal environments, so that means within our own body, and it controls the right side of the body. So any movements from my right arm is actually being controlled by my left brain. I do want to take a second to debunk the whole right brain, left brain myth. No, there is no such thing as a person being right-brained or a person being left-brained. I'm sure many of you have heard like, oh, I'm right-brained. I'm more creative and emotional. And then someone else says, I'm left-brained. I'm more logical, analytical, mathematical. I may have flipped those, but that whole concept is kind of strange because you can't really just associate yourself with one hemisphere of your brain. Again, both of these are working interconnectedly to perform these functions, and the localization of function we have within each hemisphere is very vague. It's very broad. So though we do identify like these are the things the right brain does and these are the things the left brain does, there is a lot of intersectionality between this. And so, like I was saying earlier, Broca's and Wernicke's areas are language centers, and these are mapped to the left side of the brain. And aphasia, which would be a language disorder in one of these centers, can result in different things. So Broca's area, if we have Broca's aphasia, then you would have difficulty producing sounds necessary for speech. So in your head, you can think of the word that you want to say, but you're having trouble coming up with the physical movements to make that sound. Wernicke's aphasia, on the other hand, would be producing meaningless speech. So your movement and your information of producing that speech is completely fine. It's the actual comprehension of what you're saying that doesn't make any sense. So let's take So I'm not going to play the whole thing, but you can see here like the patient is having trouble coming up with the words to describe how his leg was in pain and how something happened to his leg, but he knows what he wants to say, he just can't say it. Now let's look at Wernicke's aphasia. So he's saying that there's an end of a football in his mouth. So clearly he can produce speech just fine, but it's the meaning of the speech that's lacking in his specific aphasia. So that's Wernicke's aphasia. All right, so that's all for this lesson. A quick summary of what we covered today is looking at the function of each part of the brain, breaking it down into lobes, into right and left brain, into regions of the three cortexes of the brain, and then understanding these overall concepts, how the brain functions as a whole, and can change over time when we talked about brain plasticity, how it has language centers, Broca's and Wernicke's, and how it has this electrical activity, right? It consumes 20 watts of our body's energy. Next lesson, we're going to break down the single component of the neuron and how it behaves with respect to electricity. So there's actually a neuron in the corner of the slide right here. So we're going to take a look at how this neuron is categorized by its parts and how this plays into the entire role of electrical potentials. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's lesson.